Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for having me today and inshallah next week. I am so proud and happy to be with you, and I would like to welcome you all. Welcome every attendee for today, all the participants, and inshallah we'll take you through a very enjoyable and beneficial lectures. My name, of course, is Nehad Khanfar. Originally, I am from Nablus. Studied at Al-Najah University. Graduated from the School of Law. Then I've been working as a lawyer for a few years in Palestine. I worked in the Israeli military corps for a few years as well as a volunteer. And then I started my master in politics and international law, and my dissertation was about Palestinian resistance and international law. Then I came to the UK. I started my studies, my PhD studies in comparative law, something related to Islamic and English law. And of course, I'm now teaching in some of the British universities and a regular lecturer on issues related to Palestine, Palestinian politics, and Palestine in international law. This is, I think, something very briefly about myself, and for more ideas about more my publications, because I have some publications on the Palestinian issues as well, where I published a book few years ago related as well to the position of Palestinian resistance in international law, and it was in Arabic, so you can read it easily. I have some English publications, but in different types of legal areas. Today, inshallah, we'll take you through the main topic, which is the international law and Palestine, or in a way, Palestine in the international law. But before we start to focus on Palestine, I would like to give you some specific ideas and some technical ideas about the definition of the international law, the sources of the international law, and the enforceability of the international law. And then we will be, inshallah, considering some issues related to the refugees, specifically the Palestinian refugees. And we'll be talking about a specific differentiation between the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly. In those cases, I would like you to pay a very careful attention to every single details, because I will be trying, of course, as simple as possible, because I would like to be a bit, not simplistic, but I would like to give you a simple idea into the academic legal side of the story of the international law concerning Palestine and the Palestinian cause. Now, if we come to the definition of the international law, we would find it simply similar to any other domestic law, any other national law, as you might be aware from your own common knowledge, that law, it is something legislated by special bodies, and then it becomes like a set of regulations, a set of laws, and this can be legislated by a parliament, can be legislated by a specific bodies delegated by the parliament or by institutional process. Now, when it comes to the international law, although it would be considered to be as a group or a set of regulations or rules, but in the same time, we have completely different process of what we see in the domestic or national parliaments. So we would take it as being the law that is actually specialized in organizing the relations between the countries, the states, or nations, depending really of how we define every single one of those terms, the state or the country or the nation. But usually we would use the states, the sovereign states, يعني الدول ذات السيادة. But in the same time, the international law would organize the relation as well between the states and someone who is classified to be international character or international organization. So we have international organizations, we have the sovereign states where the international law would intervene to organize the relation between both of them. Now we have three legal areas, as you might have already following on the slides, that we have one area related to the public international law, and this is certainly would come to organize the relation between the sovereign states and in the same time the other entities. Other entities could be usually could be international organizations, or this is how it would be really addressed usually. And of course we have the International Criminal Court, one of the examples for the entities, International Court of Justice, and so on. Anything really would be addressed on the international level and recognized to be international organization would be addressed or subject to the regulations of the international law. And the other area is private international law. And this is usually would come when we have a complex of identifying or recognizing what is the domestic law to be applied on a specific case, which means that if we have too many nationalities or two different nationalities are in a legal dispute, here we would find some of the international regulations, which is called here a private international law, would intervene to know what is the exact regulation or what is the exact law to be applied on that specific case. We can give an example. For example, if we have a divorce case between a Palestinian from Gaza and between a British citizen, and here sometimes the domestic law is giving you a specific law or a specific rules to apply for the British citizen, and the Palestinian law would be giving you something different. Here the international law would intervene to decide which law would be applied on that specific case. This is called the private international law. Now we have supranational law, which is something related to the regional regulations. Like if we imagine, for one of the closest examples would be the Gulf states, where we have the Gulf Council, and they have special regulations, and those regulations are applied among those countries. And this is the same would be with the North America or Southeast Asia. Wherever you have this kind of like economic bloc, you have something related to regional trade or trading agreements. This would be something called supranational law, where all those signatories, yani any country, would sign on that agreement on the regional level, and this has existed very often and recently even becoming more common, because many of the regional powers are willing really to go out of the American domain or political domain, then they try to regulate the relations among themselves by signing special agreements, and those agreements would become part of the international law. Now, the resources of the international law, it is something would be somehow, in a way or another, related to the domestic national law, but certainly we would have like some careful consideration to the comparison between the national law and international law. We'll go directly to the point because we want to invest in the time. So the main and the most important, the most accurate and the most applicable source would be considered the treaties. The treaties, which is something really related to the international community. When I say international community in a political way, it would mean that all the countries across the world. But in this case, in our case, we would have the treaties, whether they are really internationally, globally agreed upon, or just something related to the regional agreement. But you would imagine if you have just an agreement on individual level, two individuals, two contractual parties wanted to apply something or to commit themselves with something, to implement something like a contract. So you have two parties, you have one party to agree upon something and the other party would accept that condition or the conditions, and it will be obligatory for both of them. And this is exactly the same would work with the treaties. And the treaties, in a way, we don't say aqd, we say mu'ahadat. And this kind of mu'ahadat would be certainly going within the sovereignty or sovereign states. So we would have them on the international level. So the treaties are the main things could be between just two countries, bilateral, or could be multilateral, would be like more than two countries, 3, 4, 5, 6 countries, depending really of the domain that the countries would agree upon. Now, in many times, usually they would, this kind of a treaties or this kind of mu'ahadat would articulate and state what kind of enforcement mechanism they would like to have in place. Like we would imagine some of them saying if any dispute occurred in any time during the implementation or the application of the treaty, we would like to go for the arbitration. And this is exactly what happened, for example, between Israel, between Egypt, when they took the Taba issue to the international arbitration, where the international arbitration recognized or supported the Egyptian rights in taking back all Taba with the consequences of financial compensation and so on. So, but when they signed the agreement, the peace treaty with Israel, they wrote if there was any dispute to occur, then we will go to the international arbitration. So the enforcement came as an arbitration or as going to the arbitration to solve the problem. Or sometimes they would say we would go to the International Court of Justice. In the International Court of Justice would be really obligatory. Whatever they say, we would follow. And they might go to say, for example, we would like to go to the International Security Council. It depends. So the enforcement would be enforced just as would be stated as part of the treaty itself. So you have a mechanism, and this is stated in the treaty, and this is how it's going to be applicable. Now, in the treaties usually would be considered the most important and binding or the strongest binding form and shape of having the relations on the international domain, because simply you have consent, a full consent, consensual offer and acceptance among two countries or more, and those countries willingly sign the agreement or the treaty, and they are willing to apply it. This is why it's considered in the international law to be the most strong or the strongest way of applying and establishing the international law. Now, the second one would be the custom, al-urf, and the custom usually, as it's known in the law, the national law or domestic law, would be related to the commercial activities. But when it comes to the international law, as CIL, customary international law, it would be related to this kind of state practice. And in state practice, as if they are saying, if we have a certain tradition, of course here political or diplomatic tradition, practiced for so many years by many countries, and all the countries would accept to implement that rule as it is without any modification, adjustments, objections, then it would be in the common conscious, we call it in Arabic الضمير الجماعي, would be obligatory for every country practiced this kind or accepted this kind of a practice. Now, just to shed light on how important to look into the customary international law, we would look into the diplomatic traditions, how they respect and treat or highly respect and treat the diplomatic delegations or the diplomatic commissions or diplomatic representatives among the countries. We would find, for example, before they started to articulate special regulations and law related to the diplomatic delegations, it was a practice taking place for like 2,000 or 3,000 years, going back to the ancient Greece and Romans, where the political system was really taking relatively taking place similar to the modern era as we know the diplomatic exercises. Now, this kind of international law is really highly respected, much more than from the written law. Why? Because you wouldn't find now across the whole globe any state with sovereignty, with real sovereignty, would, for example, imprison or harm or take any bad action against any diplomat. You see, so this is based on the long customary practice among all the sovereign countries, which wasn't really established just 200 or 300 years ago. It was thousands of years. Of course, we would think about many different examples. Sometimes it's about the trade, international trade. To look into, for example, the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, where you have a good deal of the international trade going through that canal, it is all actually about the customary practice of the Egyptians to allow, even in the wartime, imagine and focus on that one, on the wartime, to allow for the ships and the ferries to go through the canal without stopping them or disturbing their movement there. So this was established by, as part of the customary international law. Then, of course, it becomes part of the written regulations because Egypt wanted to get something out of it. But in general, this is what could happen across something called the international marine law. You would find this kind of traditions customary established or established based on the customs rather the written law. Now we'll go to the next source of the international law, which is the general principle of law or general principles of law, natural law. And this natural law, al-Qanun al-Tabi'i, where you would expect that every single country will behave logically, will behave peacefully, and will not accept to commit any wrongdoing against the other countries. So wherever there is a logic, wherever there is a reasonable behavior taken by any state, would be expected from any sovereign country to respect and to go with it. If we go, for example, as the example here in the slides, for the good faith, when you have a treaty or an agreement between two countries or more than two countries, you would expect the people implementing, or the countries, the sovereign states, would apply or implement the treaty's conditions without having bad faith. So it has to be really with, or we call it, to make it simple, bin nawaya al-hasana. It's not about good faith like good iman or al-iman al-jayyid. It's about an-nawaya al-hasana. So every country would be expected to implement the treaties and to comply with the conditions in a good faith without having this kind of tricky and cheating moods all the time used by the Israelis, like what happened in Oslo with with two brackets on Oslo, where you would find, for example, Paris agreement over the economic issues with the Palestinians, and the same with Taba, the same with many different things. This kind of things were born after Oslo Accords, where the Palestinians, as usual, they are applying and doing their job very faithfully, even when it comes to fighting against their own people. But the Israelis are not implementing anything and not really dealing with this in a good faith. So this will be referred to something called the general principles of law or the natural law. And natural law was mainly created actually by the Romans, because Romans started to establish this kind of rules based on the international law. Yes, someone is asking questions. I said I will answer the questions, inshallah, by the end of stream of noise is flowing. So I think we agreed. I will go through the questions, inshallah, by the end of the lecture, if you don't mind, and I hope we are still sticking to that point. It will be much more organized, and I will be in better position to give the answers. The other source of the international law, called the judicial decisions and legal scholarships. Now, judicial decisions, which we call it kind of a precedents. The precedents, for someone who is not engaged really in the legal terms, in Arabic, as-sawabiq al-qada'iyya. So we would look into many different precedents or previous judicial decisions to enlighten us in forming or interpreting the international law. And here would somehow be related as well to the legal scholarship. This is why they are considered to be coupled all the time. When we say judicial decisions, then we are, as we are supporting this by saying, and legal scholarship. The legal scholarship, it is simply the academic efforts of interpreting and explaining or elaborating on the international law. And here we have in our national law, we would have sometimes the judge puzzled about interpreting one of the text or the legal text or legal articles. Sometimes they would really seek the help from the academic textbooks, and this is exactly the same when it comes to the international law. So wherever some they are stuck in getting the proper interpretation to the international rules, sometimes they would go to refer to a very well established academics. And of course in the West, generally speaking and academically speaking as well, you would find thousands of them publishing a lot of critical views and reviews on the international rules interpretation. So this is a very easy thing sometimes for the judges or for the organization, even in the International Security Council or the International Court of Justice, to refer to this kind of legal scholarship. And of course, if they have something already published or released by another organization, international organization, they would be in a position to refer to that kind of decisions and to be implemented or incorporated in their understanding of the law. Although we still cannot call them to be an authority on the international law, so they are not part of the international law, but once they are incorporated in any decision taken on the international level, they would become part of that law. So this is actually briefly, I tried my best because we teach international law here in different manner, but here we are trying to do it as simple as possible. So those are, or these are, the basic sources of the international law. Now, after defining the international law and then investigating and knowing what are the sources of the international law, we will come to see how this international law would be enforced. Now, the enforceability, it is by itself a big question, especially when it comes to the Palestinians and the Arabs. But I would like to just to remind you that international law was never separated or isolated from the power equation. This is one. The other one, when we are talking about the power equation, we have to consider the political influence over the international law. So sometimes it's very straightforward. When we have like international crisis, we would find there is no such politics involved. But when we have a very fragile, very sensitive issue like the Palestinian cause or the Palestinian issue, we would find a lot of politics and a lot of power elements involved in deciding what kind of law and what kind of decisions are taken. Now, the enforceability of the law, we have very good experience as Palestinians, long-standing experience, I would argue, in seeing the international law enforceability failing us all along since the Nakba till the last decision or the last resolution taken in 2016. Now, When it comes to the treaties, as I explained earlier, we would find when the signatories sign, usually they will incorporate something related to the enforceability mechanism. So they would state, whether implicitly or explicitly, how they can solve the problems or interpret the treaty whenever the legal dispute is taking place. So it's very easy, it's very straightforward. But when you don't have this kind of treaties, especially we are talking sometimes about the customary sources where you don't have anything written, something just practiced by the countries and sometimes based on their own discretion, we start to lean more towards the reciprocity, المعاملة بالمثل. And here, when it comes to the reciprocity, it becomes a bit more complicated because we would have the enforceability taking like a different direction, because it would be between usually two sovereign countries where if you do something, yes, and this thing would break or would be a breach of the what we call it international law, and it would harm my, for example, sovereignty, then I have the authority to take the same action as a reaction of your own action. And here, where many countries really would be very careful, would really give a great deal for this kind of action, because no one would take like any step to harm any sovereign country, then it would be expecting to receive the same action from that harmed countries, like for example expelling some of the diplomats, summoning some of them, for example putting very high tariffs on like customs, the tariffs, like putting a lot of fees on the national products of other country. So wherever, or stopping some people and disturbing them on the airports. Alhamdulillah, it doesn't happen with us as Palestinians, not very often, but it's usually the case. If you ask some citizens to apply for visa, then you would expect the other country to ask your citizens to apply for visa. And if your visa procedures are very complicated, and it's more likely based on that rule to make it very complicated for the counterpart citizens, and so on. So this kind of would be called the customary enforceability of the international law. Now, sometimes we would find something more straightforward, and this straightforward would be considered to be kind of the collective action. And this collective action, we saw we saw similar to it many times in the region, in the Middle East, especially when it is against the Arab countries, like what happened with Iraq. But of course, if we are talking about the Balkan area, this is what happened to the Serbia when the former Yugoslavia, where we found the International Security Council intervening and issuing resolutions based on the Chapter 7 and acting violently against the Serbs, where they massacred the Muslims and ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of them. So we will find this kind of usually collective action coming from the International Security Council, where, by the way, we have to be careful about differentiating between the authority or the power of the legal power here of the International Security Council and the UN Assembly General. So big difference between both of them. But most of the actions, the collective actions, as if we are saying that we have international decision, and this international decision will be taking like a practical action on the ground, and this would be against one country, and this will be related usually to the international peace or threat against peace from one of the sovereign states. Whether this state, it doesn't mean that the state should be really a member of the United Nations or a member of the International Security Council. It might not. And this is what happened, as I said, with Iraq, and this is what happened before with the apartheid regime in South Africa, which we all know about these cases where they took really a very serious actions to stop the apartheid regime. And unfortunately, too many decisions and resolutions were enacted and issued by the International Council, but unfortunately, when it comes to Palestine, we didn't have anything materializing in a practical method. Now, the third one to enforce, or the fourth one to enforce, is called the shaming, or name and shame. And recently, just to give you an information about this, it's getting wider and wider, more common to have this related to the Israeli illegal settlements in Palestine. And we are having more countries, especially across Europe, starting from the European Parliament and ending up with every single individual European country, where they are considering this kind of, let's say, punitive action against the Israeli policies towards the settlements or towards the illegal settlements in Palestine. They are trying now to do name and shame, where they are considering a blacklist for the companies dealing with the settlements, with the Israeli ministers who are supporting the settlements, and so on, which is something, by the way, is doing something here, as we can see it almost every day, because we follow this kind of cases very often, and we find that name and shame is very effective, because the countries are very restricted from taking direct action or physical action against Israel. So it seems to be, it is one of the easiest ways of shaming the country and its legal actions, again, which is usually against the international law. So, but in general, as I said, we have the actual forces to be used, the armed forces to be deployed on the ground, and to be using many different things. If you go through, we will go through it later on, of course, but if you go through Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charters, which is starting from Article 39 till 52, I think, and it's all about the action to enforce, or the action to be taken for the purpose of enforcing the international law. And as I said, unfortunately, very few cases were implemented out of the Middle East, but most of the cases were actually against the Arabs, or when the Arabs are the party or the country to be implemented against. Now, finishing from the how we can enforce the international law, I would like you to pay a serious and accurate attention just to comprehend what is the absolute importance of the effects of the terms, because when it comes to the legal level, it becomes really completely different story from the political terms and political discourse. Why? Because you would find many different defaults happening because of the lack of understanding of a specific legal term. And of course, international law, it is like any other, as I said, domestic law. We have like resolutions, we have decisions, we have recommendations. So the terms, how we use the terms, even when it comes to the International Security Council, where we would expect some enforcement to be used, still the terms used in their resolutions are the ones to be considered when it comes to a comprehensive understanding of what that specific resolution or decision means on practical terms. Now, I would like to you to follow, just as you can see on the slides, the term resolution that is used in UN practices has a generic meaning. So there is no specific meaning really of anything called UN resolution. We don't have such a specification to be carried out, or for any action to be carried out based on the resolution issued by the UN. This is first thing to know. The second thing, recommendations and decisions are different. Both have a vague and variable meaning in the Charter. So we don't find this kind of legal accuracy of what decisions means, or what decisions mean, or what recommendations would mean, because every one has to get something different. It's about the commanding orders, yes, and recommendatory orders as well. The other things we have to focus when we read, especially in English. Most of the decisions are issued in English and then translated into the other languages. Shall as opposed to should. We have to consider when they are using shall, which didn't happen many times, and when they are using should. And this is good for all of you guys, because you know maybe better than me on this kind of linguistic issues. And then we would have recommend as opposed to demand, when they are saying we would recommend, or we would like to ask, or we would like to suggest, or we would like to urge, from we demand. So they are different. Most of the cases we were the victim as Palestinians when it comes really to the proper use or the accurate use of the terms. Now, the court, and here when we say the court, it means the International Court of Justice. Now the court uses decision for binding resolutions and recommendation for non-binding ones. And unfortunately, imagine that we have almost thousands of resolutions coming from the General Assembly or Assembly General of the United Nations, but all of them are not considered to be binding. So the binding would be used just in the decision and not the decisions coming from the General Assembly. You have to be aware of this. But we have to focus most of the times, or 99% of the times, on what is being issued by the International Security Councils. Now, the resolution a resolution becomes binding if it creates obligations. Now, in most of the cases of the Palestinian issue, or in most of the resolutions issued regarding the Palestinian issue, we have this kind of resolutions where the resolutions created obligations. But we will see later on that even when they tried to create obligations on Israel, they didn't really tolerate the other parties. In that case was the Arabs, you know. So we have to be careful when they even create the obligations. We find them making this kind of balance between the victim and the occupying force, which is Israel in this case. Now, basic types of legal effects, because we are supposed to look into the legal effects. Creating obligations, rights and or powers called substantive effects, like where they say Israel has to allow all Palestinian refugees to go back or to return back to their homes, for example, or to allow Palestinians for full freedom of movement, and so on. So it has to get really a demanding orders. It is substantive effects. Now, making determinations of facts. Sometimes we'll find Jerusalem, because we are in debate in Jerusalem nowadays. In Jerusalem, they would come to say, and we will see some resolutions later on that, saying that Al-Haram al-Sharif, it's an Islamic Arabic place or holy location. There is a fact, but the decision will come, or the resolution will come to say this fact or this proclaimed fact is correct, is right, is legal, and it is valid. Now, this will be the same if there is some legal issues were violated, like where a legal violation occurred. We will find some resolutions saying we have to stop this kind of violation, and this is actually a regular case in most of the resolutions on Palestine. Now, declarations in principle, إعلان, anything called إعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان, and so on. Declarations in principle only interpret or restate the law, so they have no legal effect, in which case they have no practicality. So that whether they would give an interpretation or they would reconfirm or affirm that this legal rule exists. Now, a resolution that just interprets the charter of the UN, of course, doesn't in theory have any legal effect of its own. So based on that, we would understand that we shouldn't just really take the Arabic translation. This is for sure, 100%. We have usually to go to the original text issued in English, because they pay a huge attention for every single English word, yeah? And this is where we have to be very careful when we consider whether this resolution is supporting the Palestinian rights or this resolution is a tricky one and might compromise the Palestinian rights, as we will see when it comes to the resolution 194 related to the Palestinian refugees. Now we'll go to the binding effect of General Assembly decisions. The binding effect of General Assembly decisions is limited, as I said earlier. Rationale matérielle, subject matter, they are related just really to things related to the United Nations itself, within the United Nations organization as entity, not as members. Or they might be just talking or imposing some decisions on the UN organizations, like for example the health organization or the agricultural organization or the Human Rights Council and so on. So the effect is very, very limited. Could be implemented within the sphere of the UN as organization, but not to touch upon the members of the United Nations. But may cover, as I said, something related really to the budget, because they, you know, they have this kind of annual budget, and this annual budget would be decided totally by this organization. So we can see that this kind of recommendatory nature of the decisions released or issued by the General Assembly are not that good when it comes to the thousands of decisions issued on Palestine. So almost has no weight, no legal effect, no legal weight. So sometimes I feel a bit disappointed when I see most of Palestinians and Palestinian supporters focusing a lot on the General Assembly decisions and resolutions. Now, one of the effects on the organization itself, which is, I think it is the most significant one, which is related to accepting a new state member. Accepting a new state member, it is something happened with Palestine as an observer, to be as an observer, and then to becomes like a temporary. And this is something where the General Assembly can accept, but they can't expel any country or any state from the membership or being a member of the United Nations. So they can accept, but they cannot expel. You have to put this clearly in mind, because if they had that authority or that power, probably Israel would have been expelled for so many years from that international organization. Resolutions of the General Assembly have no binding effects in the operational realm of international peace and security. And here, because all the power and legal authority is given actually to the Security Council, but here, just if you can have it as a note, a side note, there is a decision taken, I think in 50s, and it was numbered 377, and this decision was actually giving some authority, some legal authority of the General Assembly of taking decisions or operational decisions when the members of the Security Council fail to solve a problem related to the international peace and to solve any threat or to stop any threat related to the international peace. Its enforcement powers to suspend or expel UN members fall outside of the organizational sphere, as I have just mentioned earlier. We are approaching to 1 hour as okay, so now we will go to the other important organization or entity, which is the Security Council, and we will try to assess and to shed some light of how enforceable, how important, what kinds of legal effects would the Security Council decisions carry with regard to the international law. So unlike the recommendations of the Security Council, its decision usually, not all the time, but we can say usually, we can't really use it in a generic meaning, would have the binding force. And the binding effect of Security Council resolutions related to international peace and security, and includes enforcement under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Now then, the main legal force is derived and taken actually from the general chapter, the UN Charter. This is one. The other one, just to remind everyone, usually all the countries would try very hard to avoid being a subject of the Chapter 7. Because in Chapter 7, which as I said earlier includes like 12 articles, starting from 39 and ending with 52, I guess, and those are like an evil. It will contain certainly like economic sanctions, financial punishments, boycott, blocking diplomatic delegations, restricting the movements of the officials, freezing the money, many different things, and the biggest ever example of those, actually, the two fighting parties, Iraq and Iran, but of course for two different reasons. So Iran was subject to this sanction, and still, actually, and this is based on different decisions related to this chapter, but Iraq, it went a bit further, the extra step, and was actually attacked based on that chapter. Now, this chapter, if it is really applied, sometimes from the beginning till the practical action point, I mean the military actions are taken, sometimes it takes 5 or 6 or 7 years even. And this is, as I said, exactly what happened with the former Yugoslavia, and this is exactly what happened with Iraq. And both of them were almost around the same time in at early 90s, 1990 and 1991 or something around that time. So it's very evil. It's very evil. There is a serious shaitan when it comes to this chapter. So this is where the main power of the International Security Council lies usually. Any significant international event or situation can be characterized as a threat to peace and security. And this is very, unfortunately, it's very flexible. There's nothing definite there. So here where we can expect the political influence of the international powers to to influence the articulation of the peace and security. The precise content of the binding effect is left to the Security Council itself, and here where we find this kind of sometimes harsh discussions among all the members, especially the members with veto rights, where we will find them bargaining a lot, bargaining with money, bargaining with trade, bargaining with soft power, the diplomatic means and the procedures and so on. So it is very harsh, because sometimes once the decision is taken under that chapter 7, then it becomes very hard to remove it away or to abolish it in the future. And this is exactly what happened with Iraq, where they started to enforce it or to apply it in 1990. It has been left just 1 year ago, or less than 1 year ago. Imagine even after destroying the regime, after taking over, occupying the country, yeah, it took them 22 years just to lift this one. So it affects the country when the country is in a peacetime or in a wartime, and it becomes really very difficult for that country. So this is where you can see that Iraq is not recovering and might not recover for another 20, 30 years. We don't know. So the same, we will find that the Security Council decisions will be binding on all members of the Security Council and the non-members of the Security Council, and for the members who doesn't agree, or for the members who don't agree with the resolutions or with the decision. So it doesn't really tolerate you to commit yourself or to be committed to the decision of the Security Council, even if you disagree, even you are not a member. So it is quite comprehensive, it's quite harsh, it includes every single one on the world, no exception. The Security Council Resolution 242, 1967, and this is where we are going to start after introducing what are the importance of the differentiation between the Assembly General or General Assembly and the Security Council. We will now delve or enter our specific area, which is related to the Security Council Resolution 242, and this was directly after the occupation of 1967, because it will be considered as the second occupation. First of all, the danger of this this decision was that it recognized Israel legally and realistically to be a state with a sovereignty, or a sovereign state. So it started to deal with Israel as being a country in that area and enjoys exactly the same rights as the indigenous people of the Arab region, whether we are talking about Palestinians or Arabs. And we will see later on that when they started to take decisions on Palestine, they wouldn't actually mention Palestinians. They would mention Arabs and Arab parties, because they considered that Palestinians are not a sovereign party because they don't have independent state. Then the Palestinians are not there. They are residents, but they are not the indigenous, and they are not the people who are under occupation. They are talking to the Palestinians as being part of the Arab parties. Now, this was taken 22nd of November, as you can see, 1967, and of course was adopted anonymously. Like every country voted for this one, and no one really objected on the content. And when I see like all the countries, the main powers accepting, I would question this a lot. Now we will discuss, and then we will go through the details of the decision. It laid down or established the principles for a peaceful settlement in the Middle East. The resolution stipulated that the establishment of a just and lasting peace should include the application of two principles. So two principles of this decision: withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. And you know, we all know that it was this kind of disagreement on the translation, because in the English text, articulation said part of the lands, didn't include really the. But when it came to the French and Russian, it was asking for all the lands, to withdraw from all the lands. Now, what was the most dangerous legally? I'm talking now about the legal effects of this decision. What was the most tricky part of this decision in part one? It was that they called Israelis to withdraw, but they didn't say when. So there was no immediate effect. There is no restriction on the timing. They didn't define. They didn't say they should withdraw just in 1 week time, 2 weeks time, 3 weeks time, 1 year. They didn't. This is why we are still struggling till now about the 1967, because they never enforced any deadline of the withdrawal. This is one. The other one says termination of all claims or states of belligerency, which is the hostile and aggressive or aggression, and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty. And you have to highlight like 2 lines under the sovereignty, territorial integrity and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and organized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. And here, if you look at the Bill highlighting every state in the area, Palestine wasn't existed at that time, so they meant actually Israel, and they meant the other Arab countries. So you are talking about Israel becoming actually a legitimate occupying, although called occupying forces, and it was called a sovereign state. Yes, as its counterparts in the Arab sides. So here the Palestinians are not existed. The Israel is taking the legitimacy based on that decision. This is where we have really to be very careful when we promote 242. It's been repeatedly used for thousands of occasions, even by our political leaders, unfortunately, which they have this kind of, whether being part of the game and they know what's happening, or being just too naive and too ignorant. Now, the resolution also affirmed the territorial holiness of every state in the region and called for achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem. And I do remember that the PLO at that time, they had consistently rejected this resolution because it just focused, as you can see, on the refugee problem, which means they are talking about actually the humanitarian aspect of the whole Palestinian cause. They are not talking about the political. They haven't mentioned any political issue. And I do believe that PLO at that time was right to talk about the talk about the condemnation, or to consistently refuse this decision by the Security Council, because it puts the Palestinians just in the corner of humanitarian aids, which is something later on happened, where we have the UNRWA and all the details related to it based on the international law and international law regulations. Now, Security Council Resolution 338, and I am sure you have come across it all the time. Whenever you have 242, you have 338. Now the Security Council, as you can see, calls upon all parties. You remember when we talked about the terms? He didn't really say demand. He didn't say request. Here he is calling. Calling, it's very really flexible. It's very wide. You can't, it's very broad. You can't just see unenforceability, no enforcing tone behind using the calls. So calls upon all parties to the present fighting to cease all firing and terminate all military activity even no later than 12 hours after the moment, which happened. Because if you remember, I said 242 didn't mention any deadline. They didn't say hours, they didn't say weeks, they didn't say anything. But here they said 12 hours, and this is what happened. Although the ceasefire just collapsed, but still they managed to put a very firm language after 12 hours, you see? So then we would find them focusing again and reassuring the resolution of 242, and still they are actually excluding the Palestinians from the whole story. Now, when it came to the decisions, you follow with me, decides that immediately and concurrently with the ceasefire negotiations shall start between the parties concerned under appropriate auspices aimed at establishing a just and durable peace in the Middle East. Again, here, it's very easy to see how rotten decision was there, because not mentioning the Palestinians at all, still talking about the Arab parties, because the fighting parties were Egypt and Syria at that time, and still talking about establishing a just and durable peace, but with whom? With no indication whatsoever to the Palestinians and Palestinian rights or a Palestinian independent and sovereign state. Now, we'll go to the this series of decisions. We'll find decision number 250 adopted again. Most of them were adopted actually anonymously, and it was like, you know, strongly supported by the security members. Was 68, warned Israel against holding an Independence Day parade in Jerusalem, Israel's proclaimed capitals, and this will bring us back to what happened with the stupid decisions of Trump just 2-3 days ago, where he is breaking the international law. And here actually, where is the seriousness? We didn't see many of the Palestinians and Arabs talking about the international law. They were mentioning just like a superficial indication of the international law, but in Europe, it's been used actually very widely in the mainstream media and in the European councils and European countries, or by European governments, because it is a serious breach of the international law. Even imagine how the situation is becoming different. In 68, even the parade, just going for this kind of ceremonial issues, was not allowed and provoking the international organizations. Now, even they are actually entering Al-Aqsa Mosque, they are invading all the squares of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and there is no condemnation from the International Security Council whatsoever. We don't hear anything. We hear something from the United Nations itself, but not from the Security Council. And this would tell you what kind of position we are in now when it comes to the international law. The same would be about the 251, which was again adopted in 68, and the council was using a loose language, deplored Israel, scandalous, a military parade, and so on, which is related to the same thing, but still we could tell that it was more serious than it's being treated nowadays, where we don't have the Security Council talking about any invasion of Al-Aqsa Mosque or Al-Haram al-Sharif as it's been described for in one of their decisions. 252, it was in the same month and in the same year. The Council considered all legislative and administrative measure and action which tend, so it's all related really to the procedures taken by the occupying power. And it seems to be at that time that whether by the people who were concerned or the countries concerned about the seriousness of the issue, or because they wanted to satisfy the Arabs at that time, we don't know why they were releasing. If you can see in 1968, three decisions from the International Security Council just to condemn and to like to oppose the Israeli procedures in Jerusalem. And this is good to us. Inshallah, next week we'll see how we can consistently convey this message and focusing a lot on the international law, because especially in Europe, in the Western world, law is a key issue of understanding things and in promoting things. We don't do that. We don't do that as Palestinians. We don't do that as Arabs, and this is, I think, where we are losing a very significant part of our legal battle. Now we'll go to year after in the decision number 267 in 69, after reaffirming resolution, the previous resolution, and we can see very, very clearly the seriousness of the language of the decision talking about the annexation of the East Jerusalem. But I must say that the previous decisions were on Jerusalem, and they didn't really identify which Jerusalem they are talking about. They didn't really divide Jerusalem between Western Jerusalem or western part of Jerusalem and eastern part of Jerusalem. And this is something we never used. We never said, according to the international law, something called United Jerusalem was not and was never existed in the international law. So in general, when they started in 1969 to use East Jerusalem, it becomes a problem. It becomes a serious problem. I'm talking here about the legal term. And the legal term here is very important when you are using it in your political statements. It's very, or media statements. It's very important to be focused. So they started to divide and to talk about two different Jerusalems in 1969. Now again in 1969, in decision number 271, in response to an arson attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem by Dennis Michael Rohan, and this is one of the extremists, the most extremist settlers in Jerusalem, the council agreed that the extensive damage caused by, which is, we call it Hariq al-Aqsa, and we all know the story, but unfortunately at that time there was no action again. So this is where we started to feel, or you can start to feel, how loose and less serious the decisions becomes when it comes really to Jerusalem. But still we have this kind of international seriousness attached to it, the legal seriousness. In 1980, we have the decision number 465, which was about the Israeli settlements. And Israeli settlements, which is, as you can see, talking about the Arab territories occupied since 1967. So till 1980, we can't see any indication that they are using the name of Palestinians or Palestinian people or Palestinian residents even. We don't. We have, as you can see, the Arab territories occupied since 1967, including Jerusalem. And here again, going to the same language, including Jerusalem. It is very important to understand when they say including Jerusalem, there is a benefit, a legal benefit of using it, that Jerusalem never been divided and always considered to be occupied, when they say including Jerusalem. But unfortunately, when we started with our ridiculous negotiations with Israel for Oslo and Madrid, we started to talk about East Jerusalem. We forgot about West Jerusalem as part of the United Jerusalem, even under the international law. Now, in 1980, another decision was issued, number 476, declared that all legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by Israel, the occupying power, which purport to alter the character, and any changes in the holy city of Jerusalem, would be considered to be null. And this was supported by 14 countries, and one country abstained, which is the United States, which is something, if you remember, in 2016, when Obama administration abstained, the Palestinians were celebrating, and they were making it as they are achieving really a huge achievement, which wasn't really the case, because as we can see, different decisions were taken against the Israelis and against the Israeli occupation without the vote, without using the veto by the American administration. In decision number 478, it was condemning the Israeli attempted annexation of East Jerusalem again, and this is something very significant to the consistency on Jerusalem. And I intended actually to include all these decisions because they are very significant to our legal debate now, especially with this kind of stupid and, let's say, nasty American administration. So they are still talking about the Jerusalem, whether by its holiness or its political, geographical, and demographical aspects, and talking about some specific procedures to be taken, some actions, which is here about withdrawing their diplomatic missions from the city. So any country, this is why we say it's very important to focus on the international law and to face, like, let's say, as they were saying that Czech Republic is gonna to remove their embassy to Jerusalem. It's very easy to take them to the European Court and to stop this, because European Court would be punishing them for the breach of the international law. So still we have the benefit of using this kind of decisions. Now, in 1990, the decision number 672, we have another affirmation and reassurance of many different previous decisions, and talking about, even, let's say, compared to what's happening now against Gaza, what's happening in Jerusalem, what's happening in the West Bank, it was this kind of clashes with the Israeli occupying forces, but we found still the International Council intervening and releasing a decision against the Israeli procedures and actions against the Palestinians, which means that Palestine was much more active. Remember, if you look at this, you will find them raising the profile of the Palestinians in much serious and active way than the last 10 or 20 years, even after Oslo. Now, the Council, of course, all the time mentioning, if you notice, and you will notice in many of the Security Council decisions, the Fourth Geneva Convention. And Fourth Geneva Convention here, protecting the civilians in the war zones. And in this case, actually talking just about the Palestinians, where the Palestinians should enjoy a specific protection and should not be really treated the way how they are treated by the Israeli occupation. Now, in 1996, as you can see, as we go far and coming closer to the modern time, especially after Oslo and Madrid, we become like less attractive to the International Security Council. Less decisions are released and issued on Palestine. So 1073, the decision number, was in 1996, after recalling all resolution on Jerusalem and noting a letter from Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Arab League. Now the situation is different. Saudi Arabia is not showing any interest in what's happening on Jerusalem or in Jerusalem. They were calling like to stop the procedures. The council called on Israel to cease and reserve all acts which had resulted in aggression in the region. And if you remember, we called it Intifadat al-Nafaq, and this was in 1996, where the International Council, now many things are happening against Jerusalem, is becoming more active, more visible as well, more aggressive, and the International Council is not really acting in any way or shape. Now in 2000, 4 years later, the decision number 1322 was again talking about the scandalous visit, immoral visit, like condemning in a strong language, deploring, so using deplored, the visit by Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount. Remember, I put the Temple Mount like intentionally to remember, never use this in any of your statement when you're speaking to the foreigners. For any English speaker, don't use the Temple Mount, because Temple Mount, Jabal al-Haykal, is something promoted and used very regularly and very often by the Israelis, to the degree that many or majority of the people who are sympathetic with Palestinians and supporting Palestinian cause, but unfortunately they are using the Temple of the Mount. Although in the decision in 2000 by the Security Council, they refer to its Arab and Islamic name by calling it Al-Haram al-Sharif. This is why I highlighted both of them. So you have to be careful when you use them. The translation to say Al-Haram al-Sharif, Al-Haram al-Sharif, or Al-Aqsa Mosque surrounding area, because Al-Haram al-Sharif is different really from Al-Aqsa Mosque. So we have to be very vigilant when we use the legal terms. And the subsequent violence, which according to the resolution has resulted in deaths. And here, I don't know what was the significance or the reason, behind using just or reporting the Palestinian casualties, not the Israeli casualties. Maybe because the Israelis erupted or provoked the whole situation, and it's showing like an unsatisfied tone from the Israelis. So in general, in this regard, it supported the Israeli-Palestinian peace process because it's been started by then, and reaffirmed the need for a full respect and the fully places Jerusalem by all. But still, in general, if you notice, you will have the opportunity, inshallah, after the lecture, to look through many different decisions by the International Security Council. You wouldn't find any specific dates or deadline to enforce Israel to sit on the same table and to say within 1 year you have to finish the negotiation and everything should be sorted out. This is why the Israelis are saying we have to leave it for the negotiations and the negotiations process. Now, the last decision was related to to the settlements, of course, where we had all our Palestinians fellows celebrating, especially the politicians, and making it in the Palestinian Authority and making it to be as the only thing happened in all the Security Council history, which, as we can tell, that this wasn't really the only time. And of course they celebrated that the Americans abstained. They didn't really veto against this decision. And this decision, of course, is talking again about the obligation of the occupying power under the 4th Geneva Convention. And this is for the Geneva Convention. We have 4 conventions, as a matter of fact. One of them for the war prisoners, and one of them the civilians under or in the war zones. And all of these would apply directly to the Palestinians and Palestinian situation. So I would advise you all to read about the 4 Geneva Conventions, because they are very important to in the international law, especially when it comes to the situation in Palestine. Right of return, and this is something we have to focus, because unfortunately, something to start with, that we don't have any International Security Council decision or resolution on the right of return to the Palestinians. But this right become very important as part of the international law, because it was included in many different conventions and treaties and declarations, and then it becomes part of the customary practice or long customary practice of the sovereign states. And this is where we derived the right of Palestinians to return. Now, the right of return is a principle in international law which guarantees people's right of voluntary return, or to re-enter or entering their country of origin or of citizenship. This is related, by the way, if you remember, we said one of the main sources of the international law is the natural law, the public principles of law, which is something related to the, we call it the civilized nations, al-umam al-mutamadyina. And this is something very well established in the natural law. So you have a natural right to return to your country where you were born, or where you have an origin, or you have like immediate relatives and so on. And this is something becomes part of the international law principle. But we will see how the Israelis dealt with that. Now, a right of return based on nationality, citizenship, or ancestry, which is the genetic connection, may be enshrined in a country's constitution or law. And this is something we have really to remember, that this was not directly mentioned in the Palestinian Basic Law, which is the constitutional document for the Palestinian Authority, the right of return, which I think something we have to think about, and something we have to work on in the future, to have it part of the constitutional rights of Palestinians to return to their homeland. Yes? The right is formulated in several modern treaties, as I mentioned earlier, and conventions, most notably in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it becomes part of the natural law. It's naturally that you have this right. No one can restrict it, no one can put any conditions. It's not conditional. In the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in 1948 Fourth Geneva Convention, as I mentioned earlier. The Geneva Conventions, it has been argued, have passed into customary international law, which we have discussed earlier. International law, and that the right of return is binding on non-signatories to the convention. So Israel is not a signatory, but it's obliged by the customary, the international customary law, and by the international law or all parts of the international law to allow this to happen, whether they like it or they don't know, whether they justify we are not signatories, even the convention saying, even if you are not agreeing with that law or with that principle, you have to commit yourself to this principle. Now, legal understanding of the right of return principle has been codified in a number of international instruments, including Hague regulations. As you can see, in Hague regulations, article number 20, after the conclusion of peace, the repatriation of prisoners of war shall be carried out. So talking about the prisoners of war, it has been argued that if the Hague regulations require the repatriation of the prisoners, then it is obvious that civilians displaced, this is what happened with the Palestinians, during conflict must also be allowed to repatriate. And this is something we will discuss when we come to 194, because it contains something a bit argumentative. We have really to debate about. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 13, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Article 12, Paragraph 4, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49, individual or more mass forcible transfers, as what happened with Palestinians exactly, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power or to that of any other country, occupied or not, are prohibited regardless of their motive. They can't really deport people. And this is, if you look at the International Security Council, you will find many decisions were issued on the deportation in 1991, 1992, when it happened against Hamas leaders in the West Bank and Gaza, when they deported them to Marj al-Zuhur to South Lebanon. So this is based on this principle. Nevertheless, the occupying power may undertake total or partial evacuation of a given area if the security of the population or imperative military reasons to demand. Persons thus evacuated shall be transferred back to their homes. Even if there is a temporary deportation, then there is a duty of the occupying power to allow them to go back on their expenses as well. Now, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Article 5D, the right to leave any country, including one's own, and to return to one's country. Some controversy exists among scholars on how these articles should be interpreted. Of course, the scholarship, as a matter of fact, and the precedents before with regard to other areas of conflict, it proved that it is functioning, and it can function where a lot of the states were enforced to allow, especially in Yugoslavia, for example, former Yugoslavia, they had to allow the Muslims who were deported from their countries, their homelands, to go back and to live as they used to live before the deportation. Now, the Palestinian right of return, now to focus a bit on ours, in Hebrew it's called Zachot Hashivah, is the political position or principle that Palestinian refugees, both first generation refugees, of course when it comes to the numbers, although these numbers related to 2012, but we have too many statistics. We don't have really clarity, but we know that 750 or so were uprooted, enforced to deport and to leave their homelands and their villages and their cities, and now they become up to like maybe 5 to 6 million. Some numbers they say it is even more, and all of them, no exception, every single individual has the right to return. There is no compromise of that, unless otherwise the individuals really decided not to. And we will see if they decided not to, then we will see what is the solution, where we are talking about like financial solutions, rather just talking about really the return or compensation. We're talking about return and compensation. Now, so have a right to return and a right to the property they themselves or their forebearers left behind or were forced to live in what is now Israel and the Palestinian territories, both formerly part of the British Mandate of Palestine as part of 1948 Palestinian exodus or expulsion. And I would like you to focus, because I highlighted Palestinian exodus, and Palestinian exodus, it was really widely used in the English literature. And when it comes to us, it's usually exodus, it is something voluntary, رحيل, يعني رحيل طوعي, or it is something related to what we call it like an adventure. So the people are going to like moving from place to another because they are carrying out an adventure. So you have to be very careful as well when you use exodus. You don't have to use it. You don't use it at all. You have to use expulsion or enforceable deportation. You see? So expulsion or enforceable deportation should be used instead of Palestinian exodus. And this was, of course, as a result of 1948 Palestine war. Now, proponents of the right of return hold that it is a sacred right. It is something muqaddas. So there is, because it is part actually of the natural law, this is why it's considered to be a holy right, a sacred right. So it's given very high position in the international law principles, as well as a human right. It is higher than the human right, but at the lowest level it would be considered as part of the basic human rights, whose applicability both generally and specifically to the Palestinians is protected under international law. Now, no one would ask really any question when you are talking about international law. We started to question this when Oslo Accord was signed by the Palestinians, between the Palestinians and Israelis. But before that, it is being considered and is still considered under the international law of being a sacred right, no compromise, and we have all the time to focus on this. For the Israelis, they portrayed it to be as ambit claim, which is something related to like you are asking for too much, you are being extravagant in your claims, and you are waiting the other party to give you a counter offer. So it's part of like putting too much to take the very little. So this is where we have to be very careful when it comes to the international law, that international law principles dealing with the right of return to be a sacred right. And this is something happened in the other experiences across the world. Now, we come to the United Nations. Remember, we said there is big difference between the United Nations General Assembly, JA, and the Security Council, SC. And this, as you can see, it is General Assembly resolution. It's not really International Security Council. So as a matter of fact, it is just a recommendation. You see? So we don't have any resolution issued by the International Security Council on the right of return. Our right of return is protected or strongly protected by the other principles of the international law. And I think the Palestinians didn't work as much to have this assurance by the International Security Council, because International Security Council has a responsibility to comply, theoretically at least, to comply with the legal ethics of the international of the principles of the international law. So you would look at the resolution and find it defining the principle for reaching a final settlement and returning Palestinian refugees to their homes. Now, it resolved that refugees wishing to return. So he's giving just the a very low value for the people wishing or the people not wishing, instead of giving an inclusive decision that refugees have the natural right to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors. And this is very, 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 very dangerous, saying live at peace with their neighbors, those neighbors who are the ones actually enforced them to leave, who are the ones who pushed them to leave the country. They become neighbors, and this is very dangerous language. They could be neighbors after they leave your land and then you invited them in. But here they are actually hosting you, and you are asked to be a good with your neighbors. Should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. And this is just actually is misleading, and it is actually something very tricky. It's something intolerant. It's something like unforgivable, because saying a practicable date, the practicable date didn't come yet after 70 years. Imagine. So as I said, even when it comes to that it is recommendatory, it's not really obligatory, the General Assembly, but still when they use the language, they used a very bad language. They said a practicable date. It means who is going to decide the practicable date if you haven't decided as UN or United Nations? So they give them really this kind of flexible, loose statement, and then the Israelis, very easy to say, well, actually still not practicable yet, so we can't do it. And this is what they are doing now. They are saying it's not practical, and we are trapped in that way. So it's 194 shouldn't be really the decision we have to use when we talk about our right of return. The resolution also called for the establishment of the United Nations Conciliation Commission to facilitate peace between Israel and Arab states. There is no Palestinians here. Again, Arab states, continuing the efforts of UN mediator following his assassination. Now, if you look at this Nation Conciliation Commission to facilitate peace between Israel and Arab states, still as we are talking that the refugee issues, although the natural principles of the international law saying they have to be granted an immediate right to return, not to give all this time for another commission to discuss this and to sponsor this kind of negotiation, and then we will think about it, we will see it is practicable or not practicable, and this is exactly what's happening nowadays, where the whole issue is become really too complicated and no one is taking it seriously. And based on that, you can see that I highlighted Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Yemen as voting against this resolution. Well, there is no serious legal effects on their action, but as a matter of fact, they were actually aware of the consequences of this kind of resolutions on the Palestinian refugee rights of return. So it was wise, I think, from their sides, those Arab countries, to vote against this decision. I'm not too sure whether they were really like doing this to support the Palestinian rights, or there was another reason, but it seems to be the case here because they opposed the resolution, which was good from their side to do that. So in general, this becomes, of course, one of the basic resolutions to be used in many different United Nations literature when it comes to the Palestinian and their right of returns. Here I will stop because I have finished the time. I have finished the slides for today, and I would like to give benefited from this. Of course, as I said, it is kind of a very impressed lecture. Much more to be said and discussed and debated on this topic, especially it becomes too sophisticated, too complicated, too accurate and sensitive, but we try to give some principles, and I urge the students to do some research. But I would like really to ask you for next time, if you don't mind, to get into the Geneva Conventions, the 4 Geneva Conventions, and its relation or its impact on the Palestinian situation. I would like to see you doing something on that, and I'm asking you kindly, but I would like to have it really as a homework or a task to be carried out for the next lecture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nehad. We were looking for a homework for students. Thank you. You assigned
the homework is about really searching on Geneva, the 4 Geneva Conventions.
And please tell them what
four of them, because 4 of them, two at least, 2, they are very much connected to the Palestinian situation, and we would like to investigate the impact of those conventions on the Palestinian rights. Yeah. Yes. Well, if they make it like a slides, would be yes, much better and much simpler as well. But yeah, like a presentation, exactly. Like 10 slides. 10 slides would be like a definition of the Geneva, how it's been established, what kind of legal efforts can be impacted on Palestinian issues, how Palestinians can use it, because Palestinians are repeatedly using this kind of convention to protect many different rights, especially related to the Palestinian prisoners and related to the civilians in the war zone. So these kind of things. 10 slides would be reasonably okay. Not at all.
Thank you very much. Actually, the lecture was very rich and very expensive in legal terms that we needed to know before. Dear students, if you have any question, please write it on the chat.
Well, if she can write it, because they wrote some questions, but I wouldn't be able to follow up with them. If anyone really willing to
I don't know
just to write it once again, I will be more than happy to answer.
Yes.
How what? Sorry.
Obaida before in the first part of the lecture said asked how the court stands with Egypt.
Israel.
If Taba now with
It is with Egypt, and it's been actually given, well,
how the court stands with Egypt
historically and geographically and demographically. It's an Egyptian land, but it was disputed when the Israelis withdrawn from Sinai, but it ended up in the arbitration, international arbitration, and the court actually decided or approved the Egyptian demand, and now all with Egypt. So my student has to correct the information. It is under the Egyptian control. Inshallah.
For Haya and Baya, I think. Haya, the homework will be sent to you by email. Baya, the lecture will be uploaded on our channel on YouTube within 3 days. Haneen is asking Dr.nehad, I really appreciate the session, including all those valuable information. Our history is really full of events and resolutions. However, I just feel that even if one has no history or rights, if the country is powerful, it can control and manipulate everything. The decisions and the statements, not the comments is not completed.
Yeah. Some decisions and the statements sometimes are meaningless.
They just thank you, Dr.nehad. Yes, Haneen completed the
well, it's as a matter of fact, I believe for so many years that we are having a missed opportunity, or a huge missed opportunity, to sue the Israelis in Europe. In Europe, we have this kind of public trend in the last, let's say, 10 years, which is kind of sympathizing with the Palestinians and Palestinian cause, but it's more actually about the legal actions where in Europe the judicial system is not politicized yet. And this is where we find, for example, some cases succeeded to chase and to prosecute the Israeli generals as war criminals. And this is what happened with Sharon in Spain, previous on Sabra and Shatella, wars in Gaza. For many times, many of the Israeli generals now, even diplomats, I mean politicians, they are really very hesitant, very afraid, very concerned of visiting many European countries because of the law. So I think focusing on different parts of the international law and having the fact we have International Security Council resolutions on that might really, at least, if it doesn't really affect the Israelis, but certainly it would disturb them and it will restrain their hands from like taking more nasty actions against the Palestinians. Of this, we study history and know well who has the right and yeah. This is why you have to utilize your abilities in different sense. You have to keep fighting in many different. People would like to say non-violently. People would like we have to have this kind of armed armed power, which is happening. And as a matter of fact, even the International Security Council guarantee in many resolutions that the Palestinians, they have the full right of fighting against the occupation. So we have to talk more about the international law. We have to use every single statement issued against Israel and was part of the international law to make the people more aware. I think we have not done this for the last 20 or 30 years because we become too lazy. A lot of people just becomes part of this Oslo Accords to enhance their social prestige, financial positions, you know, all these kind of things. You know it more than I do. And then just they left everything really related to the international law, and international law is very important. Still, you can confirm something. It's better to have something rather having nothing. Yes. How do you see the international law could help Palestine to get its freedom? Well, it's part of using the international law as a pressing instrument against the Israel, but it has to be first of all consistent. It has to be professional. It has to be sponsored on all levels. So you can't just ask the Palestinian Authority to do that. You can't ask Hamas only to do that. You can't ask really just some organizations to do that. You have to have like this kind of international efforts, and I do believe we have many people, many organizations across the Western countries, especially in Europe, who are more than happy. And something we don't know as Palestinians, we have the third generation across Europe who are becoming lawyers, who are still affiliated and attached strongly to the Palestinian cause, and by themselves, if they find someone to organize their efforts, you will make a hell for the Israelis in Europe, and you might even prevent. Look, you have to look at them as terrorists all the time and using the international law where no one can condemn, no one can deny, yes, just to tell them that you are the terrorist and this is something, and war criminals. And this, as I said, this had worked before and it can work, but you have to have some organization, and based on that you might find like this kind of positive actions from the European countries. You can't do everything by yourself, but I am sure if you push more. Nowadays, everyone has to comply with their public support, like what's happening with Jeremy Corbyn in his labor leadership here in this country in the UK. He is one of the strongest supporter of the Palestinian cause, and if he becomes a prime minister, then he will be positive about Palestine. So this is this is something could happen. It's not something really we can't do anything about it. So we need to work on that, but we have to be organized rather just randomly working, just some efforts here and some efforts there. في الاتحاد قوة. Yeah, of course. Yeah, inshallah.
We hope to organize the effort to.
I will do it on Hungary.
One day.
Yeah, I didn't understand. What does that mean? Is it doing something related to international law?
Hungary.
Okay, okay. At your service.
Maybe she lived in Hungary. I don't know.
The same here. Same here.
Thank you very much, Dr.nehad. We have the pleasure to have you with us today. Actually, we had a very extensive term information. The lecture was very rich. I think the students enjoyed and got the benefits they look for. Dear students, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure, and I wish you. By the way, here we have a heavy snow in London.
Time, inshallah.
And yes, still snowing, but I wish everyone a very warm night over there.
MashaAllah.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Khair, inshallah. Thank you so much. في أمان